Canadian roadways are becoming a death trap as fraud, abuse, and criminality infiltrate the trucking industry, but one province is fighting back.
Usually if you're a bad driver, you're doing other bad things as well. So that's why physical enforcement is always the best way to curb bad driving behavior. Whether it's a federally licensed or even provincially licensed, we need to do a better job of sharing information of who the bad guys are in the industry, because they're ultimately the ones that give the industry a bad eye when they continue to operate in unsafe manners.
In the Canadian province of Alberta, the government has been cracking down on unsafe and fraudulent trucking operations, shutting down companies, pulling licenses, and going after driver training schools accused of putting improperly trained truckers behind the wheel. And Transport Minister Devin Dreeshen has been making the case that this isn't simply about paperwork violations or a few bad drivers, but the bigger picture that these deadly rigs have become as dangerous. Operators have taken over Canadian roadways. And there's another question that deserves considerably more scrutiny. What else can law enforcement uncover when it actually stops, inspects, and investigates these operators? Because according to Dreeshen himself, physical enforcement can expose far more than a traffic violation. And that was all too clear in my recent report that featured never-before-seen body cam footage of an Arizona state trooper pulling over a Canadian Indian origin trucker for what appeared to be a routine traffic issue, only to uncover millions of dollars worth of cocaine hidden throughout the rig.
Well, obviously, when we're pulling over the bad truck drivers, you can catch lots of things. So to make sure that the unsafe and the fraudulent trucking companies, to have more oversight over them, they're usually going to be doing something worse than just bad trucking and bad trucking behavior. So usually when you go out and do these physical types of enforcement, you can catch additional types of bad behavior, and that's something that we've seen across the board. Even routine traffic stops, that you'll have additional charges than just someone going through a stop sign. So usually if you're a bad driver, you're doing other bad things as well. So that's why physical enforcement is always the best way to curb bad driving behavior. But the 20 different trucking companies that we shut down here in the province of Alberta, they were just operating in an unsafe manner. And we've also shut down 5 driver training schools that were giving licenses to people in a fraudulent manner. So we were having people behind the wheels of 18-wheelers with Class 1 licenses that were given out inappropriately. So the crackdown that we did not just helps out in having better future drivers, but also taking bad truckers off the roads and bad trucks off the road today. So that work has been started back in October of this year. And we're looking forward to seeing what the new statistics are going to be of how we're seeing less bridge strikes, less accidents, and just better driving out on the roads. But we're not done. There's obviously more audits and more inspections that our team at Transportation Economic Corridors are going to continue on.
Now, part of that enforcement means cracking down on the bigger issue, and that is the loopholes that allow bad operators to keep moving between companies and provinces. These are often described as chameleon carriers or chameleon companies, businesses that shut down, change names, restructure, or register under a new corporate identity with the same people behind the wheel. This makes information sharing between provinces and between Canada and the U.S. critical to stopping unsafe and fraudulent operators from simply reappearing under another name. There is a similar concern with the temporary foreign worker program here in Canada when employers control a worker's job, immigration status, and sometimes even their housing. Workers become dependent on the employer and thus become vulnerable to exploitation and less likely to report any of this abuse. The United Nations flagged Canada's system as being ripe for abuse years ago. Take the Bishnoi Gang, for example, a notorious Indian organized crime syndicate led by Lawrence Bishnoi. And Global News' recent investigation that they have capitalized on and exploited Canada's student visa program. Not only is it a designated terrorist entity here in Canada, but members of the gang recruited people in the country who were here on student and temporary worker visas to carry out extortion-related crimes. The point isn't that immigrants themselves are always the problem, but that weak oversight combined with let's admit it, awful policy, fragmented information, and exploitable immigration allow for corporate structures to be utilized by bad employers and, at least in some cases, organized crime. That is why governments need stronger information sharing and enforcement across provinces and between immigration, labor, corporate, and law enforcement authorities, not just paperwork and audits. And that's exactly why we have launched a special website dedicated specifically to this coverage at stopdeathtruckers.com.
We have seen in some of these trucking companies, and especially some of the chameleon carriers, an abuse of the TFW program. So some of the shutdowns or even penalties and fines that we've issued have been through an abuse of that program. So that's it's one of those. It's not the only reason why these trucking companies were being shut down, but it also was a factor that went into us being able to shut down some of these bad trucking companies. So at our federal, provincial, territorial meetings, provincial transportation ministers like myself and others have been advocating to the federal government to have additional information sharing, especially when it comes to federal carriers, because that's a federal jurisdiction, to make sure that these types of interprovincial trucking companies, that we as the provinces have full clarity and insight into their operations, so that we as the enforcement arm on the ground have more better understanding of how they operate and where they're operating. So that's something that other provinces have been advocating for at the national level, to make sure that we have that additional information. And again, that really helps on those chameleon carrier types of situations where you might have a bad trucking company in province X, and then they just change their name slightly and set up shop in province Y. So whether it's a federally licensed or even provincially licensed, we need to do a better job of sharing information of who the bad guys are in the industry, because they're ultimately the ones that give the industry a bad eye when they continue to operate in unsafe manners. So that work continues on. We're also looking at a Red Seal certification of truck drivers across the country. That's something Alberta has led. So whether you're journeyman or getting your ticket as being an electrician, it would be a similar process to be a truck driver in Canada. So that is something that Alberta has led. We need 5 other provinces to sign on with that work, but that is something that we're continuing to do to try to increase the professionalism in the trucking industry across Alberta and across Canada.
Across Canada, the reality and the crux of the issue is not only finding out who the bad actors are, but making sure there is a cohesive strategy across the country. If one province identifies an operator as a problem, but another province has no visibility into that history, then that enforcement system essentially becomes a game of jurisdictional whack-a-mole. This is especially concerning when the stakes aren't just damaged infrastructure or basic traffic violations, but they're deadly. Applying a national professional standard similar to the certification model used in skilled trades makes sense. If you're going to operate an enormous commercial vehicle across this country, the standard for proving you're qualified shouldn't become weaker simply because you've crossed a provincial border.
Well, I'd say we can always learn from others. I think this crackdown that we've done in Alberta, the proof's going to be in the pudding of how better our traffic safety stats are going to be with taking down these 20 unsafe trucking companies and shutting down these unsafe driver training schools. So obviously enforcement is very important. But we're also looking at changing Alberta's Traffic Safety Act this upcoming fall session. So there is going to be some legislative changes that we're going to do here in the province that I hope other provinces across the country look at, to see that maybe there's something that they could take out of Alberta's playbook to make sure not just the enforcement on the ground, but also the rules of the road are better, to make sure that everybody can get home safely and has a better experience driving on our roads.
Alberta's crackdown is an important step, but again, you can write the best rules in the country, create the best licensing system, require the best training. But if nobody checks whether those rules are actually being followed, they're just words on a page. And that brings us back to the thing that Dreeshen emphasized from the beginning. Physical enforcement, which is where Alberta's approach raises an uncomfortable question for the rest of Canada, particularly Ontario. I'm looking at you, because Ontario has one of the country's largest trucking industries and some of its busiest highways. So if Alberta is increasing audits, shutting down unsafe operators, targeting fraudulent training, and pushing for stronger national standards, why shouldn't the same level of scrutiny be expected elsewhere? Should Canadians expect the same basic standard of enforcement regardless of which side of a provincial border they're driving on? After all, a dangerous commercial truck doesn't become less dangerous when it crosses from Alberta into Saskatchewan. And a company with a history of unsafe practices doesn't magically become legitimate when it changes its address. So all in all, the real test still lies ahead. It's not based on press releases or how many companies get investigated. It's whether this enforcement actually produces measurable results. That means fewer unsafe trucks, fewer fraudulent licenses, fewer bridge strikes, fewer dangerous drivers, and ultimately fewer Canadians getting hurt or killed on our roads. There's a legitimate debate to be had about how aggressively governments should regulate Canada's trucking industry. Truckers are essential, there's no doubt, and the vast majority are professionals. But that is precisely why the worst operators have to be dealt with, because a company that cuts corners on training, when a carrier ignores safety rules, when a licensing system is manipulated and exploited, the consequences don't stay inside the trucking industry. They end up on the highway with the rest of us. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini.